There's a number that the National Weather Service published this week that almost nobody is talking about, and it is the number that explains everything about why the next 72 hours of American weather are about to become something that meteorologists will be writing case studies about for years. That number is 5. 5 inches. That is the margin. 5 inches of water level that separated the Cheboygan Lock and Dam Complex in northern Michigan from complete structural failure on the morning of April 17th, 2026. 5 inches between a dam holding and a dam releasing a wall of water directly toward downtown Cheboygan. 5 inches between an emergency that was being managed and an emergency that became a catastrophe. And the reason that number matters for what is coming this weekend is not because the Cheboygan Dam is the story. It is because the Cheboygan Dam is the symptom. It is the most visible, most dramatic, most measurable evidence of what happens when an atmosphere that has been running in a state of sustained, relentless, historically anomalous violence for 6 consecutive weeks meets a landscape that is no longer capable of absorbing another drop of water. And then, this weekend, is asked to absorb more. Because the cold front that is sweeping across the country right now, the same front that ended the first major heat wave of 2026, the same front that brought severe thunderstorms and damaging winds to the Ohio Valley on Saturday, and freeze watches to the northeast by Sunday night, is not simply a weather story about temperature and precipitation and wind speed measured in isolation. It is a weather story about what happens when a relentlessly active atmosphere adds one more layer to a landscape that was already at its absolute breaking point. And then the models show clearly, unambiguously, with the kind of agreement across multiple major forecasting systems that meteorologists describe as a signal rather than noise, that another round is loading for the middle of next week that could be worse than what just happened. And what just happened included 3 particularly dangerous situation tornado warnings in 81 minutes, a dam within 5 inches of failure, a Wolf River in Wisconsin running a full foot above its own all-time record flood stage, and an East Coast that just experienced a heat wave so extreme, so early, and so prolonged that forecasters at AccuWeather use the phrase borderline unprecedented to describe its duration. What is coming this weekend is serious. What is building behind it for next week is something that the Storm Prediction Center is not yet willing to fully define, but is already refusing to dismiss. Start with the heat wave, because without understanding what the heat wave was and what it did to the atmosphere and the landscape across the eastern United States over the past week, the cold front that is ending it this weekend cannot be fully understood. Beginning in the second week of April 2026, a powerful ridge of high pressure locked itself over the eastern half of the country and did something that high pressure ridges in April are not supposed to do for this long. It held. It refused to move. It sat there day after day, drawing heat and humidity northward from the Gulf and the southeast in quantities that belonged to July and August, rather than the third week of April. Washington, D.C. hit 93 degrees Fahrenheit. Richmond, Virginia hit 94. Philadelphia and Atlanta challenged daily records that had stood for over a century. Central Park in New York City saw temperatures approach 86 degrees. Across nearly 600 locations from the plains to the northeast, high temperature records were approached, tied, or broken. For approximately 160 million Americans, daily temperatures were exceeding what is normal for June, not April. The AccuWeather senior meteorologist Alex Sosnowski described temperatures across April as running 2 to 8 degrees above historical averages in the east, and AccuWeather-led long range. Meteorologist Paul Pastelok added the detail that explains why this matters for what comes next. Multiple days of unusually warm conditions, he said, will tend to accelerate budding and blossoming earlier than usual. Plants responding to air temperatures they have no reason to expect will not change course simply because a cold front arrives. They bloom when the thermometer tells them to bloom. And this week, the thermometer told tens of millions of trees, vines, bushes, and newly planted annual flowers across the Midwest and Northeast that summer had arrived. Early, ahead of schedule, irrevocably. And then, on cue, the atmosphere changed its mind entirely. The cold front that swept eastward across the country beginning Saturday is one of the more significant pattern-changing boundaries to cross the contiguous United States this spring. Not because it arrived with violence, though in some places it did, dragging organized clusters of severe thunderstorms capable of damaging winds and hail across the upper Ohio Valley and central Appalachians on Saturday, producing a level 2 severe weather risk for eastern Ohio and western Pennsylvania, including Columbus, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh, with a level 1 broader threat extending across the rest of Ohio, northern Kentucky, much of West Virginia, and western New York. A tornado or two could not be ruled out with the more organized storms, where 40 to 50 knots of effective wind shear, oriented oblique to the front, gave individual supercell structures just enough rotational potential to make forecasters unwilling to write off the tornado threat entirely. But the violence of the front's passage through the Ohio Valley was almost secondary to what the front's arrival meant for the temperature profile of the entire eastern United States in the 48 hours following its passage. Behind that cold front was not simply cooler air. It was a Canadian surface high, a dense, dry, Arctic-sourced air mass building southeastward into the region that took temperatures which had been sitting in the 90s on Friday and Saturday and replaced them with highs in the 40s to low 50s from Michigan to New England by Sunday, continuing into Monday. That is a temperature swing of 40 degrees or more in less than 48 hours. Frost and freeze conditions arriving Sunday and Monday nights. Pockets of freezing temperatures reaching coastal areas including Long Island, New York, and southern New Jersey. Every tree that bloomed early. Every annual flower that was planted during the warm stretch. Every bud that opened in response to air temperatures that felt like July, and now must face air temperatures that feel like November. All of it exposed, all of it vulnerable, all of it at risk from a cold snap that meteorologists are describing with the specific language of biological consequence rather than simple meteorological measurement. This is not just a cold front. For agriculture, for orchards, for the gardeners who followed the thermometer's instructions and planted too early, this weekend's temperature crash is a killing frost, arriving at the worst possible moment in the plant calendar. But the freeze threat, as real and as consequential as it is for the landscape and the agriculture of the Northeast and Midwest, is not the part of this weekend's story that belongs in the category of genuinely serious. That category belongs to the water. Because the cold front arrived at a landscape that was not prepared to receive it, not because of the temperature, but because of everything that was already in the ground, the rivers, the reservoirs, and the dams, before a single additional drop of rain fell this weekend, consider what was already true before the weekend storms began. The Wolf River in Wisconsin was running nearly a full foot above its all-time recorded flood stage. Not above flood stage, above its record. A threshold that, until this week, had never been reached in the modern observational record for that river was exceeded by a full foot. The village of Shiocton, Wisconsin, declared the majority of its streets impassable. Evacuations were ordered in Waupaca County. New London called for emergency sandbagging volunteers. More than 20 separate river monitoring locations across Michigan and Wisconsin had already hit major or record flood levels before the tornadoes of April 17th had even formed. And then the storms of Friday added 0, 5 to 1. 25 inches of additional rainfall across southern Wisconsin alone, with locally higher totals, onto ground that had already saturated beyond its capacity to accept more water. Soil so completely full that every additional raindrop was routing directly into rivers that were already at their limits, and in some cases past them. The weekend storms added 1 to 3 more inches across Michigan, Wisconsin, and Missouri on top of that. Nowhere was the consequence of this saturated landscape more visible, more dramatic, or more terrifying than in Cheboygan, Michigan, on the morning of April 17, 2026. The Cheboygan Lock and Dam Complex, a publicly owned dam on the Cheboygan River upstream of downtown Cheboygan, was measured at 5, 16 inches below the top of the dam at 8:45 in the morning. 5 inches. The difference between containment and catastrophe measured in the width of a human hand. The dam's ability to pass floodwater downstream had been severely compromised because the hydroelectric plant connected to it had been non-functional since a fire in 2023, shut down for 3 years amid a private ownership dispute, despite the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, sending warning letters for years to a shifting cast of owners who were granted extension after extension while the equipment cracked. The retaining walls deteriorated, and federal inspectors documented malfunctioning gates that were crucial to managing exactly the kind of flood event that was now occurring. Records showed that as far back as 2019, 7 years before the flood, regulators had warned about cracked concrete and damaged infrastructure at this dam. The Michigan legislature vowed to make dam safety a priority after the privately owned Midland dams failed in a similar pattern in 2020. Ultimately, legislators did not act on the proposed reforms. And so, on the morning of April 17, 2026, 75, Consumers Energy workers were deployed in a round-the-clock emergency effort to restart a turbine that should never have been allowed to sit dormant, while Cheboygan County Sheriff Todd Ross stood in front of cameras and said the sentence that captured the entire regulatory failure in 9 words. It's privately owned. There's only so much we can do. Newaygo County Emergency Services, downstream along the Muskegon River, was less diplomatic. Their public notice to residents in the floodplain carried a sentence that emergency management agencies do not use unless they mean it precisely and literally. Expect flooding conditions worse than the April 2014 flood. Evacuate immediately. Public safety services will no longer be available until conditions become safe to respond. The turbine was ultimately restarted Friday afternoon, a crisis narrowly averted, water levels beginning to fall. But the Muskegon River downstream was still climbing. Flood warnings remained in effect through Sunday for nearly 24 northern Michigan counties. And the additional rain from the weekend's cold front passage was still coming. This is the landscape that the weekend storm system is moving across. Not a landscape at rest, not a landscape with spare capacity for additional water, not a landscape where the rivers have room to rise a few more feet without consequence. A landscape where the room is already gone, where the rivers are already at or above record levels, where the dam emergency was barely averted by hours and inches, where the soil is so saturated that additional rainfall has nowhere to go except into systems that are already overwhelmed, and where emergency managers across Michigan and Wisconsin are watching radar loops with the specific kind of attention that people pay when they know that the next measurement, the next crest report, the next river gauge reading could be the one that changes everything. Now, here's the part of this story that the weekend forecast alone does not capture. The part that makes what is happening right now not just a serious weekend weather event, but the opening act of a pattern that the Storm Prediction Center, Prediction Center, and every major global ensemble model are pointing toward with increasing alarm for the middle and end of next week. The cold front passes. The Canadian high builds in. Sunday is quiet. Monday is quiet. And then the atmosphere, which has been delivering rounds of severe weather to the American heartland with the mechanical regularity of a conveyor belt that nobody ordered and nobody can turn off, begins to reload. What the models have been showing consistently in the days since the Storm Prediction Center issued its Day 4 through 8 outlook on April 17th is a signal that forecasters describe as the specific. Combination of features that gets their full attention regardless of what week of the season it is. A large-scale trough developing across the western United States, a deep dip in the jet stream centered in the western CONUS, with multiple shortwave disturbances rotating around its base, is forecast to begin interacting with a Gulf moisture return by the middle of next week. The ECMWF, the GEFS, and the EPS ensembles are all showing it. The evidence that elevates this from possible to probable is what the models show happening at the surface ahead of that trough. Mid-60s Fahrenheit dew points across the plains and into the Midwest by Wednesday through Friday. Mid-60s dew points in the third week of April are not a minor detail. They are the same moisture signature that fueled the Cape values approaching 3,500 joules per kilogram on April 17th. They are the same moisture pool that sat beneath the supercells that produced 3 particularly dangerous situation tornado warnings in 81 minutes. The GFS and the ECAIFs go further than the ensembles. They show a consolidated mid-level trough, rather than multiple smaller disturbances, which is the atmospheric configuration that produces not a scattered severe weather event, but what the Storm Prediction Center's own language called a much more substantial, severe weather event across the central and southern plains. Day 6 through Day 8 of next week, Wednesday through Friday, multiple days. The SPC's exact words from the April 17th, Day 4 through 8 outlook. Day 6, Wednesday to Day 8, Friday will likely feature multiple days of severe weather across portions of the central and southern plains. The Climate Prediction Center's probabilistic hazards outlook adds a moderate risk of high winds for portions of the Great Plains and Southern Rockies on April 24th and 25th, with the Econs ensemble showing at least a 40% chance of wind gusts exceeding 34 miles per hour across that risk area. And behind all of it, running beneath it like the low note that defines the key of the entire piece, is the flooding signal. The Climate Prediction Center's outlook flagging possible flooding for parts of the Great Lakes region and the upper and middle Mississippi Valley from persistent near to above normal precipitation, accelerating spring snowmelt over the next 2 weeks. The snowpack in the Great Lakes watershed is above normal, the soils are already saturated, the rivers are already swollen, and the models are pointing toward more rain arriving in the same region that is already, right now, operating at the outer edge of its capacity to manage water. Take a step back from the individual forecast elements and look at the pattern that April 2026 has revealed in its 17 days of existence. By the time the April 17th outbreak concluded, the United States had recorded 356 confirmed tornadoes for the year, up more than 40 in a single week. The heat wave that ended this weekend set nearly 600 temperature records across the country. The Sheboygan Dam came within 5 inches of failure. 20 or more river locations in Michigan and Wisconsin hit major or record flood levels. 3 particularly dangerous situations. Tornado warnings dropped in 81 minutes on a single afternoon. The Wolf River ran a foot above its all-time record. Vermont recorded its first April tornado in 76 years of documented history. And the atmosphere responsible for all of it is not exhausted, not weakening, not retreating into a quiet pattern that will give the Midwest and the Great Lakes region time to recover. It is pausing, briefly, the way a storm pauses between waves. The continental air mass pushing through Monday and Tuesday is not a season change. It is a reset. The atmosphere taking a breath before the mid-60s, dew points return to the plains, before the next trough digs out of the western CONUS, before Wednesday and Thursday and Friday of next week produce what the models are consistently describing as multiple days of severe weather across a region that includes the same states, the same river basins, and in some cases the same specific communities that are still cleaning up from what April 13th through 17th delivered. AccuWeather's total forecast for the 2026 severe weather season is 1,050 to 1,250 tornadoes, near the historical average. That number sounds reassuring, but the historical average assumes something that 2026 has not delivered, which is that the season's energy is distributed roughly across the spring months, with quiet periods providing recovery time for communities, for emergency management infrastructure, and for the landscapes that absorb the rainfall that severe weather systems deliver. What April 2026 has produced instead is a front-loaded, relentless, historically anomalous concentration of severe weather events arriving in rapid succession, each one landing on a landscape still saturated from the one before it, each one testing emergency management systems that were not designed to run at maximum capacity for weeks without pause, each one dropping onto a region where the rivers never fully came down between rounds. The 5 inches above the Cheboygan Dam crest on the morning of April 17th were not a coincidence. They were a measurement of how close the accumulated weight of 6 weeks of atmospheric violence had pushed one specific piece of physical infrastructure to its absolute structural limit. And that infrastructure is not alone. Across Michigan and Wisconsin and Iowa and Minnesota and Illinois, there are dozens of other measurements being taken right now. River gauges, dam pressure readings, soil saturation indices, flood stage comparisons, each one representing a specific place where the margin between managing and failing has narrowed in ways that were not true before this season began. The weekend storm is serious, not because of what it is bringing on its own. It is serious because of what it is arriving on top of. And what is building behind it for next week is something that every atmospheric signal currently available to forecasters is pointing toward with the kind of consistency that the Storm Prediction Center reserves for situations it considers genuinely, measurably, documentably real. The atmosphere is not finished, it is reloading. And the landscape it is about to reload into has already used up most of its margin.